Hello, you punctual people. Thank you for being on time. I'll just give a minute to see if somebody else jumps on, and we'll start our conversation with the inspection contingency.
Okay.
Good.
Um, yeah, as Joan said, we're going to go over the inspection contingency. I'll just do a quick intro just to kind of set the stage for next week too. So we're going to do like the inspection contingency in terms of how it reads in the offer to purchase and go over those lines specifically and discuss right to cure. And then next week, we're going to kind of take this and like apply it practically and like go over best practices in terms of negotiating an inspection. So, you've got your roadmap here within the provisional language, and then how do we put that in practice? So,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, it's one of the more, I don't know why that's not fitting.
I
Okay.
know.
Uh, did you set it to 50? Oh, no, it's 47.
Let's try it again.
That's the trouble I kept having with it. It wouldn't stay at the size that
You know what I'm gonna do?
ah,
Oh, actually here. Yeah, this is very strange.
yes, that's part of my history. That's fine.
You read this okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
What I did here is just cut out the inspection contingency part of the offer and talk a little bit about inspections versus testings. Um, we've gone over this before, and if this is new to you, this is a good explanation of this contingency. It is one of the more difficult, sort of like in financing, and it's obviously one of the more important. A buyer can refuse to have an inspection and sign the refusal waiver, but in my long history in real estate, I've always seen the consequences come up of not having an inspection. And so that's why I encourage it. So the first part of this is they're talking about the difference between inspections and contingencies. The inspection contingency is marked here, as you can see in the next section on the offer. But it is very different from the testing contingency, which is in the addendum A at this point. Radon is a test that is only on the offer to purchase. All other testings are on the addendum A. And there are only like a few tests that can be run. So a lot of agents say, well, we don't know what we need to test. Well, it goes back to your buyer at the time of writing the offer. Do you have breathing problems? Are you allergic to stuff? Like, does mold bother you? Do you want to test for this when you saw the house? Is it something? And this is what a test is. So, what this little paragraph talks about is what are the differences between inspections and testing. And our offer is trying to explain to you, keep them separate. They are not to be bound to one another. They're not to say, whatever the inspection says, we'll test. Um, they are separate and they are meant to be kept separate through the offer. Any questions about the difference between inspections and testing? What they have here in a note is any contingency authorizing testing should specify the areas of the property to be tested, the purpose of the test, and to determine if environmental contamination is present, any limitations on buyer's testing, and any other material forms, uh, terms of the contingency. So that's very important when you're deciding whether to put in testing as well as right here putting in the inspection contingency. So going forward, your guidance is basically to in instruct your buyer to what's important and to what they need to get. So a lot of this is transactional based on your buyer, based on the property, based on the condition and things like that. So assuming you are going to have an inspection, you mark the inspection contingency. This contingency only authorizes inspections. They repeat it again, not testing. See lines 178 to 192. This offer, number one, is contingent upon the Wisconsin registered of or Wisconsin licensed home inspector performing a home inspector of inspection of the property after the date on line one, which is after the date of the offer was written. Number two, this offer is further contingent upon a qualified independent inspector or independent qualified third party performing an inspection of. Now, in the past, and I'm happy to see it finally going away, most agents used to put on that line entire premises. Don't. It says that right in the contract. It says inspecting the entire premises. What that blank line is for in number two is any area of the property that you might want to bring in another inspector or a specialist or an engineer or something like that. So if the chimney looks a little wonky up on top, put in chimney. I want to learn more about the chimney situation. If the foundation is a little drippy, you might want to put in foundation on that line. It's like, where do we want to zero in? And I want to be able to have the right, the buyer is saying, to bring in another person within this inspection period that we're setting out to find out more about this particular situation. So that's what you put on those lines. Don't put entire premises because you're being redundant. So it says list any property components to be separately inspected, like a swimming pool, roof, foundation, chimney, etc., which discloses no defects. And number three, buyer may have follow-up inspections recommended in the written report resulting from an authorized inspection, provided they may occur prior to the deadline specified in line 206. Inspection shall be performed by a qualified independent inspector or an independent qualified third party. That's hard printed in the offer, and what that means is don't bring Uncle Bill in, who's a handyman or a contractor or something, because if he's not properly licensed in the state or qualified, his notifications of defects cannot be used in your notice of defect. So only a notice of defect recommended by some defects of a qualified inspector will be able to be used. So make sure that that's good. It's also very good to have very few family members with you on touring a house or at an inspection. They bother the inspector. Some intimidate the inspector because they always have something different to say or more to say than the inspector. But you're hiring a qualified state inspector who knows his boundaries, knows his rules, and knows in his mind what a defect is. So,
I'd love to interject here. I almost had a dad blow up a deal this past month.
oh, oh,
And it was, yeah, it was like it was really absurd actually. It's like
right.
anyway.
And that becomes an issue. It might be, makes the buyer who may be a first-time buyer and he's there with his dad and his dad, rules and he probably can't get around what his dad says. But he can't use that or use any information that the dad comes up with in a notice of defect if it's different than the report.
Right.
So, um, so buyer may have follow-up inspections recommended in a written report resulting from an authorized inspection, provided they occur prior to the deadline specified at line 206. Inspections shall be performed by a qualified independent inspector or an independent qualified third party. So on the next page, it talks about the caution, so I cut it off there.
Oh, let me get this bigger. Here, let me see if this one will. Hmm. Thanks for bearing with us, guys. I don't know why this is.
Well, it's me. I can sort of read, yeah, no.
I'm gonna make this larger.
Okay. Yeah, I
Good.
can get that.
Okay.
So we're starting with line 204, which is the caution. Buyers should provide sufficient time for a home inspection and or any specialized follow-up inspections as well as well, I said follow-up inspections. That means that if you're saying you want 10 days for the inspection, which is a pretty common time, or 14 days are pretty common, you have to make sure that you get that inspector in right away at the beginning of this period of time, because if things come up and if you have to hire another expert or professional or contractor in to check a specialized area, you want to have time to get the report back, to read it, to think it over, maybe even to get some estimates of the cost of those things. Um, if you've got a cap in addendum AC, you've got to figure all of that out. So you're going to need starting pretty much with inspection on day one and use the rest of those days to negotiate. It's very important to have the time. A lot of times a buyer will not extend the inspection contingency period of time. They want it shorter, you want it longer, but the seller will say, no, we're not extending it, wrap it up, within the date. So it's very important that you set enough time in your inspection. As I said, it's usually 10 to 14 days. If you go in longer than that in the initial writing of the offer, the seller may even balk at that. This is an important contingency in selling their home, and they want it done and over as soon as possible. Okay, so caution. And as they say, anything in bold or says caution, read it. Make sure your buyer reads it. A proposed amendment is not a notice of defects and will not satisfy this notice requirement. Oh, I missed the part in between. The contingency shall be deemed satisfied unless buyer within, and that's where I'm saying your days, they're saying 15 if left blank, after acceptance, delivers to seller a copy of the written inspection report dated after the date on line 1 of the offer. So it's got to be within that time the offer is written and the time for the inspection to expire. And a written notice listing the defects identified in those reports to which the buyer objects, and that's the notice of defects. So you want to have time after you have the inspection to maybe write the seller an amendment first, see if you can negotiate what you want done, with how it's done, with who does it, with all of these qualifications, with invoices and lien waivers and all that kind of thing. That all goes on the amendment to negotiate the inspection contingency. But if those amendments aren't signed by the seller and you're not going anywhere, then that's when the notice of defects is to be considered. And they give you the phrase right there, the defects to which the buyer objects. Um, so a proposed amendment is not a notice of defect and will not satisfy this notice requirement. So an amendment is our back and forth. We're dealing, we're negotiating, we're going back and forth with the buyer and the seller. And if there's no progress in that, nobody's signing that amendment that's going back and forth, then you get to the near the deadline of the inspection contingency. That's when you flip out the notice of defect. If it is not sent at that point before the inspection contingency expires, that buyer is buying the house as is. Something has to be done before the expiration of the inspection contingency within that time. Now, as I said, you can ask for an extension. You don't know yet. You're not sure how much this is going to cost me as a buyer. But you have to take action prior to that its expiration date of the contingency. If it goes past, this is our biggest warning to new agents. Don't let it go past that expiration date. If you're working with the buyer, then send a notice of defect right away. That'll stop that clock. And now you can either go back and negotiate, or if the seller has the right to cure, then the seller can start to decide whether he's going to cure or not. But you have to stop the clock, or else your buyer is buying the house with warts and all. So any question about that particular point, about that expiration date, it's very important, and especially with new licensees, we kind of hover around like a mother hen, making sure that you understand that you can't go beyond the expiration date because your buyer will be very mad at you because he has to buy the house, he has to go to closing without any repairs or replacements. Okay, have you sunk in enough on that? So now we get to what a defect is. So what that caution says, a proposed amendment is not a notice of defect and will not satisfy this notice requirement. For the purposes of this contingency, defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, the nature and extent of which the buyer had actual knowledge of or written notice before the signing of the offer. Would be like something in the details about the listing. It would be something that would be in the seller's condition report. It would be something that would be noted by the seller to the buyer before writing the offer, before signing this offer. So this is a very tricky line. It's called the famous 210 line because it comes up quite a bit. A buyer and an agent that may not be experienced enough will put in the notice of defect. I'll use one that happened to me, cracks in the driveway. And I had mentioned that in the details and the data for the listing that cracks in the driveway are noted, hereby noted. And this buyer who had an accepted offer, his agent put in one of the defects in the notice of defects, cracks in the driveway. So I called him very pompously and said, you can't put in cracks in the driveway because we made sure that you were made aware of that before you wrote the offer. So you can't use that as a notice in your notice of defects. And he said, well, then you should read the contract more carefully, Joan, because on line 210, it says, for the purposes of this, defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, the nature and extent of which the buyer had actual working. He said, if you look closely, I have crossed off the word not. So it was reading defects do include structural, mechanical, and other conditions to which the buyer had actual knowledge. I had missed the word not being crossed off, and so he had changed the offer by crossing that out, saying they could use any defects that they were made aware of.
I think best practice is just to strike both of those lines versus
Yeah,
just the word not. So,
right. Yeah, just crossing the word not was a little too
yeah,
late.
yeah.
But if you really want to get into this more, want to see what the inspector says, are a little worried about it, and it was noted, say, in the property condition report, I would cross those two lines out, 210, 211. But it was a lesson I learned at the time. So let me see. They get into there now, 212, the definition of what a defect is. This is very important, and this is where you actually use this definition of defect. And I'm going to put this in and I'll repeat it in a little bit too. The inspector has this same definition of the word defect, except for one factor, and that's the factor would here in this would have significant adverse effect on the value of the property. An inspector cannot um, consider the value of the property that you're buying. So his notice of defect, his notices of defect in his inspection report are going to include the other two elements of a defect, but not regarding the value. So in this definition of a defect, this one in the offer is the full and complete uh, court-used definition of a defect. And it says, a condition that would have significant adverse effect on the value of the property, number one, that would significantly impair the health or safety of future occupants of the property, number two, or that if not repaired, removed, or replaced would significantly shorten or adversely affect the expected normal life of the premises. So those are the golden rule of the definition of a defect. And sometimes you might need an attorney to interpret that for your situation. Your buyer might want an attorney's opinion on, is this a defect or not? But this is the full definition of a defect. And as I said, the inspector will only consider number two and number three, but not the value of the property. So I hope that's clear. That's an important element in this inspection contingency. Any questions? Okay. Now we get to right to cure. And when you are, oh, geez, when you are writing the offer, it is a very transactional question whether you're going to have right to cure or no right to cure. Right to cure means the seller, when presented with a notice of defect, has a period of time, usually like 10 days, to make his decision on whether he's going to cure those defects that you've listed in your notice, or he won't cure them. And it has to be all or nothing. He can't pick and choose what he's going to cure or not cure. So to satisfy the notice of defect, the seller has a choice. Is he going to have the right to cure? Then he has 10 days to decide to notify the buyer, don't worry, I am going to cure all the defects that you listed. He may decide not to. Maybe it's impossible for him. Maybe it's way too expensive for him. And then he sends a notice and saying, it will not cure the defects. At that point in time, the offer is dead. But there is this little hope of 10 days where the seller may decide to cure the defects and then the contract goes to closing. So that's why the difference of choosing as you're writing the offer with your buyer to choose either giving the seller right to cure or not giving the seller right to cure. The seller does not have the right to cure. So as it says here, seller shall or shall not, and it's shall, it defaults to shall if neither is stricken. So if you miss it, the seller is going to be giving right to cure. Has the right to cure the defects. Seller has the right to cure. Seller may satisfy the contingency by, and it gives you these three options. Delivering written notice to the buyer within the 10 days or whatever you picked, stating the seller's election to cure. So he sends a notice within those 10 days or wherever and says, I will cure the defects. Or the seller can say, curing the defects in a good and workmanlike manner. So he can cure them. And delivering to buyer a written report detailing the work done no later than 3 days prior to closing. So he has the right to cure, and then he gives the buyer the right to come in 3 days before closing to show that he's cured the defects. This offer shall be null and void if buyer makes a timely delivery of the notice of defects and a written inspection report. And number one, the seller does not have the right to cure. And the seller has the right to cure, but the seller delivers written notice that he will not cure, or the seller does not timely deliver a notice within that 10 days to say whether he's curing or not. At that point, the offer is null and void if those things show up. So if the seller comes back and says, I'm not going to cure, and that means all of them that are listed, the offer is null and void. Or if he doesn't respond within the 10 days, if the seller doesn't respond within the 10 days, the offer is null and void. Those lines are very important to clarify what a notice of defect is so that you can explain it to your buyer. And I think it's a very important issue that you need to bring up with your buyer so that he understands right to cure. It can be confusing. Steph and I are always available to take your calls if you're a little bit confused on the right to cure or whether or not to give the seller right to cure. Now remember, this is a seller's market and we want to please the seller in every way we can. So if we put in our offer and send it to the seller, and maybe the seller is getting a few more offers, but our offer says the seller does not have the right to cure. The seller, unless your offer is spectacular in other ways, the seller might just toss your offer because, in a way, not giving him the right to cure is sort of an option instead of an offer. And because if he does not have the right to cure and you send a defects that he's not going to cure, the minute you send the notice of defects, that offer is null and void. So that's why sellers don't like not having the right to cure, and it can trash your offer from the beginning. Any questions on having the right to cure? Got it? Okay, we'll move on. This is weird. When I went through my slides, they were all perfect. Oh, there it is. Okay. The home inspection contingency provides for 3 forms of inspection, and this is sort of a repeat. The following slides are zeroing in on the most common questions that Steph and I get about the inspection contingency and are important parts to note. So this is what we're going to be going into. And in the 3 forms of inspection conducted by a Wisconsin registered home inspector, any enumerated component inspections, say they just want to go in and inspect the chimney, that's it. Follow-up inspections recommended in a written report from one of the previous authorized inspectors. So if they have a report, say, um, from the roofing person that you may need a new roof, or they have a report that says, um, that expert that you wanted to come in and look at the wonky chimney, that will need these repairs and things like that. So you have those three ways of inspecting your house and knowing what's important, what's going to cost you, and what's going to be good. Note the ability to conduct a follow-up inspections, but not testing, is limited to those inspections recommended in writing by an authorized inspector. So it's inspection to inspection, not inspection to test. The blank lines at 197 and 198 should be used to only list the specific components of the property that will have specific inspections and should not refer to testing. And those are the lines that I said, do not put in entire premises. You're putting in those specific areas and you have follow-up inspections.
I think a good example of this, I always use a roof example, like when you're showing a home and you can tell that the roof has been compromised, the shingles look very old. And the buyer wants to have that inspected right off the bat. That's when it would be appropriate to list roof on those lines 197 to 198 versus waiting for the inspector to call it out.
Right.
Because then it's the home inspector's recommendation, which gives you the authority to order that follow-up inspection. But if you just put it right in lines 197 to 198 right off the bat, then you've been given permission by the seller right away to have that inspection. So kind of think about it in that way.
Mhm. Good
So,
point. Yeah, it's a very confusing part of the inspection contingency,
mhm.
and it's so important. I mean, if the buyer feels that they're being sort of trapped into buying a house that they really don't like the condition of, and this period of time during the inspection contingency seems to go very fast. And a lot of times it overwhelms the buyer to make a decision that maybe they regret. Um, so it is something that you really need to understand yourself and then to be able to educate your buyer into the choices that they have when they write the offer. Okay. Seller has to give access to the property. There is sometimes a seller will not let an appraiser in, it will not let an inspector in, say, whatever. If the seller attempts to prevent a person who is authorized per the terms of the offer, such as an inspector, tester, or appraiser, access to the property, the buyer may be able to successfully argue the seller is not acting in good faith. In the offer, the seller agrees to allow any of the buyer's inspectors, testers, appraisers access to the property to satisfy the contingencies agreed to in the offer to purchase. And that's why it's important for you as, say, a buyer's agent to understand all the lines in the offer, to know that they have a right to bring in an appraiser or the right to bring in an inspector or a tester, and that the seller can't stand there and say, I don't want them. If the seller doesn't want a particular seller, excuse me, the seller doesn't want a particular inspector or appraiser, maybe they had experiences in the past with a particular person, they can put that in the listing contract that they are not going to allow so and so. And that happens sometimes. But otherwise, the offer stands. It's hard printed this way, and it's something that the seller needs to understand access. Okay. The buyer is required to give the seller copies of the inspection and testing reports. In the past, what usually happens to agents who are not quite understanding this, their thought is, well, there are really no defects that the buyer has, or there are no repairs that the buyer wants done, so we didn't send over the report. This is saying, and the offer is saying very clearly, the buyer agrees to promptly restore the property to its original condition after buyer's inspections and testing are completed, unless otherwise agreed to with the seller. Buyer agrees to promptly provide copies of all inspection and testing reports to the seller. Seller acknowledges that certain inspections or tests may detect environmental pollution, which may be required to be sent to the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. This obligation is separate and independent of giving a notice of defect or attempting to negotiate an amendment for repairs. And as I said, some agents will say, well, there are no repairs we want the seller to do, so we're not going to send the offer. The offer to purchase says you have to send the report and in a timely manner, which is pretty much as soon as you get it. So another time, agents will wait until they're ready to write the amendment, and then they send the report with the amendment. A better practice is to send that report right away, and then you and your buyer can come up with the amendment. But as I said, it's hard printed in the offer. It rules if both parties have signed this offer, and it is something that you have to um, make sure that you're following. With promptly restoring the property to its original condition is also very important. Some inspectors get a little, I would say, proud of themselves and start showing things that, how much they know and everything like that. And they'll take apart this and they'll show them that and things like that. But then they forget to put it all back. Um, Drain tile testing is a classic because that actually disturbs the floor of the basement, and that has to be restored to its original condition. So there are things in the offer, these little phrases sometimes, not even a sentence, that are very important to how you sell real estate and how you guide a buyer in a buyer agency situation that you need to know and that you need to be aware of before these things come up. Next one. The right to cure provision is transactional. Seller shall have the right to cure or seller shall not have the right to cure. This is a real, I think, bug with me because I hear a lot of agents say, oh, I always give the seller right to cure, or not hear that too much anymore, but I never give the seller right to cure. Because it is a seller's market, almost everybody is giving the seller right to cure. Your offer has a little very little life expectancy if they don't have the right to cure. Um, but I want to stress, don't ever say, I always give the seller right to cure, or I never give the seller right to cure. That is a very binary black and white choice that should be considered to the actual home, to the actual buyer, to the actual transaction, to the actual cost proposed to buy it. All of those things have to be taken into consideration whether or not you're going to give the seller right to cure. As I said, in this market, we are almost always giving the right to cure, but there could be situations that you and your buyer are facing that it's best to not give the seller right to cure. If it gets to the point where your buyer wants to send a notice of defect, that offer is null and void the minute it's sent. And that's why sellers don't like it, but it may be a way for your buyer to keep control. It also may be a way for your buyer to not get his offer accepted in the first place. But it is something to consider on each transaction and not generalize and say, oh, I always do this or I never do that.
Mhm.
And this is a nice sort of compact way of describing the right to cure. The buyer delivers to the seller a notice of defects and a copy of the inspection report, giving the right to cure or not the right to cure is drafted to say the seller shall have the right to cure. The seller then has three options. Deliver to the buyer within 10 days written notice that the seller will cure the defects, thus keeping the offer alive. The seller must cure the defects in a good and workmanlike manner and deliver to the buyer a written notice detailing the work done within 3 days before closing. Deliver to the buyer written notice that the seller will not cure the defects. This option makes the offer null and void. Or third thing, do nothing. This also makes the offer null and void. So if the seller never sends a notice back saying he's not going to cure and it goes past the 10 days or whatever, that automatically kills the offer. So the seller shall have these three options. Um, and if you want to just save this slide, it's something that is a good to reflect on. If you give the seller shall not have the right to cure, the minute the notice of defect is sent, that offer is null and void. So it kills it.
I think it's important here too, and we're going to hammer this home next week as well. Um, but just to kind of have an understanding that the right to cure like gives the roadmap for how the contract can play out if negotiations break down.
Mhm.
But the goal is always that the buyer and seller are going to come to a meeting of the minds in terms of how a repair or a defect is handled, whether it's a price reduction or that the seller agrees to fix it. And they're going to do that via an amendment. And again, we hope it never even gets to this right to cure provision, because buyer and seller have come to an agreement before this would even ever come into play. So just kind of having an understanding of that too is helpful, and just kind of understanding how the the inspection contingency is negotiated. It's also I've always said it's kind of hard to explain the right to cure because, again, this may or may not come up in the offer itself. So, but we do need to lay this out ahead of time, in case it does get to that point.
Yeah, correct.
So that's what the goal of the right to cure is essentially. So.
Yeah, remember the right to cure only pops up um, for consideration when a notice of defect has been delivered.
Yeah.
Sometimes agents are talking about the right to cure when you're going with amendments back and forth. No, not until the notice of defect does the seller then have the three options if he gets a notice of defect. Now, sometimes, and I don't want to get too much in the dirt with this, but there's sometimes when the seller will call or the seller's agent will call the buyer's agent and say, the seller is willing to pay for, or the seller is willing to credit, or the seller is willing to fix such and such defect, but will not fix the rest. And so what happens? A notice of defect has already been sent. We're at the cross the red line
Hmm.
part. But if there's still time in the inspection contingency and the buyer and the seller and their agents start saying, well, maybe there's a little crack here. If the buyer does if the seller will repair this or the seller will credit this amount of money, what do we do now? Because we've already sent the right to the notice of defect. Well, what you can do, and you can call Steph and me if you want step by step, but what you can do is send an amendment over. Number one, removing the notice of defects. And number two, propose what the negotiating factor could be. Seller is willing to credit, or seller is willing to reduce the price of the property, or seller is willing to cure this defect only. Now we're back at the amendment stage. We went backwards to the amendment stage, and we're going to try a little more negotiating.
Mhm.
Sometimes that can save an offer. And, the buyer gets a little, well, I guess I could fix these other things, and they end up going to closing. So the notice of defect is a hammer down. It is something that is, poised right there to null and void the contract if the seller doesn't want to cure. But we can sort of sneak back in, remove the notice of defect in the amendment, and then state what the buyer or the seller are willing to do. So that amendment can come from the buyer or can come from the seller.
Mhm.
But it needs obviously both signatures to agree.
Yeah.
Okay, next one. This is just, I don't think many people do it anymore, but I've heard about it with some agents calling on questions. Um, it's not that it's prohibited, but it is not good practice. Just do not send the notice and the amendment together. Okay, this is what we're willing to negotiate in the amendment. We want you to do this, we want you to do that, and we want credit for this, and we want Bailey's Hardware to do that, and um, that's all done on an amendment. But then the notice is listing the defects that if the seller doesn't want to cure, the deal is over. Don't send them together. Send the amendment, fill out, take the time if you have it to negotiate what you want to go back and forth. Maybe the seller doesn't like the amendment that the buyer sends initially, so the seller can come back with his amendment. And then maybe the buyer doesn't like too much of that, but they can just take out one point and come back with another amendment. You can bounce back and forth with these negotiating amendments as long as you stay within that timeline of the inspection contingency. But if you send the notice at the same time, it's sort of an intimidating factor and it doesn't do anything. It halts or hurts the negotiating mood. So what you want to do is try to settle the deal with an amendments or amendments till you get one signed by both parties, and then no notice of defect is needed. If there's a big standoff and buyer and seller cannot agree on anything in the amendments going back and forth, then it's time to cut bait and send the notice of defect.
Well,
Um,
and other things that sending the notice of defects will do, it will trigger the seller's option to call the offer null and void if they want. And if the buyer did not have that intention, you could put them in a precarious position. And that buyer could be upset with their buyer's agent for potentially losing the house for them. So yeah, you wouldn't want to do that unless you're absolutely, yeah, an intimidating move. Too
right.
strong. Yeah.
Yeah, and always call us if you're in a predicament like that. But
Yeah.
it's something that over the years I've tried to correct from agents who send them together. It's been my bailiwick. Just don't ever send them together.
Mhm.
Do some proper negotiating.
Mhm. Okay.
Um, a notice should not include how the defects are to be fixed and the name of the company to make the repairs. Steph and I come up with this question a lot, or most often we see um, notices of defect by other agents in other firms because our agents and firms are pretty well trained. Um, but sometimes we'll come across, or one of our agents will come across a notice of defect that has been sent to their buyer excuse me, to their seller that gives all these qualifications, how it should be done and what should be done and what it does and why it's a defect. And then and they're putting in they want the name of the company to make the repairs. All these things are off of a notice of defect. The notice of defect may say, this is a notice of defect. Following are the defects to which the buyer objects. If you started off with that classic old line, then you are set up to just list the defects, which is what a notice of defect is for. The inspection contingency provides that the buyer may give written notice listing the defects identified in the report to which the buyer objects. It is not appropriate for the buyer to dictate how the seller will cure in a notice. It's not only not appropriate, it's not a correct notice of defect. The seller's obligations to cure are outlined on lines 216 to 226 in the offer to purchase. If the buyer wishes to negotiate method for repairing a defect, then you use an amendment is the appropriate tool before a notice is sent. So remember that line, this is a notice of defect. Following are the defects to which the buyer objects, and you list the defects and that way, the seller is prompted to look at these defects and decide whether they're going to cure them or not. Okay, important slide. Um, I brought it up a little bit when we were talking about the definition of a defect, and there are those three elements. The inspector cannot weigh in on the value of a property, so he cannot use the first definition of a defect, but he can use the second one, which is it would impair the health or safety of the future occupants of the property, and he can use the third one to, if not repaired, removed, or replaced, would significantly shorten or adversely affect the expected normal life of the premises. That's what the inspector is using to define defects in the inspection report, but he cannot weigh in on the value of the property. So the offer to purchase is the one that has all three components of the definition of a defect. And that's what should be referred to in negotiating, and that's what should be referred to in the courts. So just keep that in mind.
Okay, I think that's our last slide.
That's the last slide. But again, we're here if your questions. It is a complicated contingency. And of course, it's very, very impactful to your buyer. So make sure that you understand that contingency and all the ins and outs of it before you give the choices to your buyer. Any questions? Good.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you guys next week.
Bye-bye.